Good morning, everyone. Hope you've had a great week. It's just now ending. I think today's Friday. It's hard to remember because you don't have any schedule when you're retired. I do these every day, so I don't keep track. The only thing I've got going for me is my son, in an attempt to raise money, is donating plasma. And he can do that twice a week, and he gets about $100 a pop. He does have a GoFundMe that if you would help out on that, he wouldn't have to do it as much, but it's all right. And he's got a problem with one of his arms that a number of years ago, it almost died nerve-wise, and they got it back, but it's not 100% strong. So he's, in attempting to do his ministry work, he's trying to get Social Security on that. And if he gets that, he won't have to work because it's difficult for him. He can't do, people who do ministry work often do work with their hands to make money to get by. He can't do construction work because he can't lift with it. You got to carry 2x4s around. Well, he could drag it with his good arm, but he can't carry it well. Anyhow, pray for him and help him if you can. Let's look at servants of God. We all are to be servants of God. We've been restored to God through Jesus. So now we got to work for him. And I say got to, I mean, it's a choice. As a Christian, I want to work for God. I enjoy doing these videos and working for God. Now, I probably wouldn't have enjoyed this were I not a Christian. There's not a whole lot of accolades for servants. Most people look down on servants. They're trying to pay reparations to those generations back that were slaves, to the blacks. I'm sorry they went through that. It was a horrible time. We had a civil war over it. But many people have been slaves. Many races have been slaves. I don't think there's any race left out of this slavery bit. It's just an instigation to get us stirred up again. We're getting along with blacks if you leave us alone. But they got to keep this going because they get to make money off of it. They get their little empires from it. There's still some animosity towards blacks, unfortunately, in this country. But it's only there because it's ginned up by people who are making a living from it. All right, let's talk about our scriptures. We know that we have a great teacher in the Spirit that lives within us, and we shouldn't learn anything from the Bible without it. Satan doesn't have the Spirit, and he doesn't learn the Bible the way it was meant to be. He learns it the way we do without the Spirit. That's why he's been wrong so many times. He never would have crucified Jesus or allowed it to happen if he knew what was going to happen, but he didn't. He doesn't know when the rapture is. And that's why we don't either. It's to save us from him. So, who's the best teacher in the Bible? Well, of course, Jesus would be. And we've been studying him. But what about his hand-picked people? He picked Saul of Tarsus. When the Jews rejected him, Jesus, he selected Saul, to take the message to the rest of the world. Jews, if you won't accept me, I'll go to the common folk out here, the rest of the world, the people that don't have a religion to claim, don't have a heritage, don't have the law. I'll show you. I can make bread out of stones. But what about Paul? What made him a good choice? Well, Paul was, as I named him, from Tarsus. His original name was Saul, and Saul means prayed for. So his Jewish parents wanted him to have a future with God. And he would have been a normal Jewish boy growing up there. He would have had his bar mitzvah and do all the other stuff, have to read from the scriptures as part of that. He would have been a normal Jew. And he was educated. He was probably in a wealthy enough family. His parents probably were slaves, but apparently their masters were good slave owners because they helped them out, and eventually when they became 40, they released them. They gave them freedom. And that would be how Paul got his Roman citizenship. Now, this is common beliefs. You won't find a lot of this in the Bible. We're going to look at the book of Acts here in a little while in this series. But a lot of this stuff is just conjecture that they've had for years about Paul, who's now Saint Paul, according to the church. I don't know if he would have approved of that. Nevertheless, that's his earthly title now, Saint Paul. There's a good little video series to see some of the areas that he was in. When he was selected, and we'll get into that, he went on 3 missionary journeys over into basically Turkey. That's where Tarsus is. So he went to his home area that he's familiar with. All right, I shaved yesterday and it itches. I'm frank with you here on this channel. Anyhow, Paul, who he was to become, and Paul, by the way, means small and humble. God gave him that name. Why? Because Saul was probably prideful. When Paul asked God to take away his affliction, whatever it was, God said, "My grace is sufficient. Deal with it." I had to deal with it, but that's the summation of it. Probably to keep him from getting a swelled head. He was working for the God that we all worship directly. He heard from Jesus. We all would love to do that, to hear from Jesus. I don't know that I want to go blind first, but I would definitely put up with that if I needed to. Just to hear from Jesus down here on earth. But Paul, being educated and having a life planned out to work for God, goes to Jerusalem, where you have to basically, to become a Pharisee, which is what he became, you had to basically live in the Word. Now, he only had to memorize the Old Testament, because they didn't have the New Testament yet. He's a co-writer of the New Testament, but it hadn't been written. They would have had the Torah, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which included Leviticus, which is like reading the phone book. Sometimes you have to read the phone book. Genesis and Exodus, those are fun. There's some stuff in Numbers, but it's all pretty much covered in Genesis and Exodus as far as the history, which is what I like. So Paul, being educated as a Pharisee. And the Pharisees were those that were very strict on following the law. Unfortunately, they didn't follow the law, even though that was their claim to fame. People would make comments on the law to explain it to people so they could get them more involved in following the law. We're going to go to Matthew 23 next, and you're going to see what Jesus thought about following the law. But they end up writing, I've talked about this before, their own commentaries. The Talmud and the Mishnah were basically priests throughout the centuries have written their comments in there, and it got to be a prideful thing to have your name in one of these. And they would make comments about their opinion of what this meant and what that meant. They didn't have the Spirit of God in them back then. So this would have been their opinion. And they were often wrong and often neglecting the true purpose of what the Scripture was for. But it gave them a prideful thing to do this, a powerful thing to do this. Now, before we move on, we're going to talk a little bit about Pharisees, like I said, were those that were very strict with the law. You have to follow it to the nth degree. Sacrifices and all this stuff that you have to do, you got to do them perfectly, and they were really big on this. The other sect in Jerusalem was called the Sadducees, and they were basically the temple workers. They'd come out every day and light the lamps. They do all the things, the rituals that had to be done. The only big difference between them and the Pharisees, other than their work, is they didn't believe in the resurrection. We hear Jesus talking to the Pharisees a lot. The Sadducees didn't really care. Nobody understood his destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it. They didn't understand that. Either sect didn't understand it. But the Sadducees would have been really offended by that if they knew. And after his death and then resurrection, and he's around preaching again, the Sadducees got involved. They were offended because they didn't believe in it. But the Pharisees didn't like the teachings because they had not been teaching what Jesus was trying to explain about what the Old Testament scriptures really meant. Nicodemus comes to him. What does it mean to be born again? He didn't know. He was a leader. And he didn't know. The other leaders, they didn't know. So let's go ahead and move to Matthew 23. I was going to pick out just one or two verses, but I think that the whole chapter is pretty much taking the Pharisees to the woodshed. So Matthew 23, verse 1. Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They're carrying on the legacy. Therefore, whatever they tell you to observe, that observing you do. So Jesus is saying, follow what they tell you to do. They know the law, so follow them. Comma. But do not do according to their works. This is Jesus describing his earthly workers, the Pharisees. The scribes are kind of lumped into them because they're the ones that write the Bible and know it pretty well. For they say and do not do. For they bind heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on men's shoulders. But they themselves will not move with one of their fingers. Not move them with one of their fingers. They won't lift a finger to help. It's a modern way to say it. They put these heavy burdens on, and they won't help, and they don't follow the same thing. But all their works they do to be seen by men. We've heard before how Jesus talks about doing things to be seen by men. They have their reward. There's nothing waiting for them in heaven because they're doing it to be seen by men, not by God. They make their phylacteries broad. The phylactery is a little box of prayers that they would strap on their head. Now, they should be like, just a couple inches square. They would make them bigger to make them look more holier because they've got more prayers they're carrying around. They would pray on corners of the streets in Jerusalem, but they would... I brought my coffee with me this time. And you can see by the fog, it's very humid. It's been raining again. Most of the big stuff is going south of us, but we did have a really bad rainy day. And I come to find out that our radar is about 10 minutes slow, even though it says it's real time, 5 to 10 minutes. I go to my son, we better go sit in the car. I'm off a rabbit trail again. Go sit in the car because there's a really big, bad rain cell coming at us. And some wind, but no tornadoes. I think there was one south of us, but not here. And so we go get in the car, and I'm walking through 2 inches of running water on the ground. It's just really torrential, and I'm thinking there's a bigger one coming. So I go with my umbrella, and I call my son in the other tent because it's raining so hard, and I didn't want to get out, and I wanted him to come join me. So we go sit in the car, and within 5 minutes, it completely dies down. So the big bad stuff that I wanted him out of there for was happening right when I was getting out of the tent. A lot of rain. And I made the mistake, and it's my fault. I still had my air conditioning hose running out the door, and it was partially open. So I got water in my tent during that deluge. I had to clean it up when it was over. My carpets are still drying out. I think God laughs because we just don't see all this stuff. We try to rely on things down here on earth, and they let us down constantly. God never lets us down. Okay, so they have broad phylacteries and enlarge the borders of their garments. They wear fancier than normal clothes. They love the best places at feasts, the best seats in the synagogue. Jesus said, "It is better for you to sit in the back of church and be invited to come up to the front than to sit in the front and have them ask you to vacate the seat for somebody more important." A little bit of sage advice. Be invited to come to the front. Everybody will see it. But don't be prideful. They love their greetings in the marketplaces and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi, Rabboni in Greek. Teacher, that's all it is. Jesus was a rabbi. They called him teacher. But you do not be called rabbi, for one is your teacher, the Christ, the Messiah. And you are all brethren. You're all normal people, men. Do not call anyone on earth your father, for one is your father. We're talking spiritual. We do have a physical father. But our Father in heaven is the ultimate Father. And it says, he who is in heaven, your Father. And do not be called teacher, for one is your teacher, the Christ. But he who is the greatest among you shall be your servant. Jesus constantly called people to be servants. He washed the feet of his disciples. We are to be servants. If we get promoted to head servant, that's okay, but it's still servant. and whoever exalts himself will be humbled. He's chiding the religious leaders now for not being a good example. And he who humbles himself will be exalted. Now, it may not be on earth. It may only be in heaven. But here we go. In verse 13, he starts his tearing into them. But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites. He says woe to you a bunch of times in this chapter. Jesus speaking to the Pharisees here. He hasn't really dealt with the Sadducees because they were workers, they were servants in the temple. Their big problem was not believing in the resurrection. But they were still servants in the temple. For you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for you neither go in yourself, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. They don't let people into heaven because they're not following the law perfectly. And they don't follow it perfectly, so therefore nobody gets into heaven, according to what Jesus was saying. We can't get to heaven by following this book. You only get to heaven by accepting Jesus Christ. That's the only way in, and it is a free gift. You can't earn it. And these people back then were being taught you have to earn it by following the law. If that were true, then Jesus' whole life was a wasted time. Well, we know it wasn't. Jesus came here to save us from ourselves because these highly educated people were not helping people to get to heaven. For you devour, this is continuing on, again, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites again. This is in 14. For you devour widows' houses, and for the pretense make long prayers. Jesus said, you pray long prayers because you think you will be heard for your much speaking, as the translation has it, for your long prayers. You think the longer the prayer, the more we're going to hear? The simplest prayer can simply be, God, help me. If we have the Spirit in us, God knows exactly what our need is before we even utter those thoughts even. Therefore, you will receive greater condemnation. Talking to the Pharisees. And in 15, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you travel land and sea to win one proselyte. To get one convert, you travel. And when he is won, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. Condemning words from Jesus. He did not like organized religion. Christianity is not a religion. It is a relationship, commonly told by people, but hopefully lived by people. Again, 16, woe to you, blind guides who say, whoever swears by the temple, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gold of the temple, he is obliged to perform it. Fools and blind! Exclamation point. I should be yelling, but I would wake up this calm, serene environment. For which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifies? The gold? You know how God feels about idols. And whoever swears by the altar, it is nothing, but whoever swears by the gift that is on it, he is obliged to perform it. Who is the gift? Jesus. fools and blind, exclamation point again. For which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifies the gift? Therefore he who swears by the altar swears by it and by its things on it. He who swears by the temple swears by it and by him who dwells in it. And he who swears by heaven swears by the throne of God and by him who sits on it. Again in verse 23, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, exclamation point. For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of law, justice, mercy, and faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone. Blind guides. Walking around with your cane leading people. Who strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Kind of like the log in your eye and you're trying to get out a splinter. 25. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you cleanse the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of extortion and self-indulgence. When you wash the dishes, do you just clean the outside and leave the food clinging to the inside? Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, then the outside may be clean also. I don't know what that was, but you can see the ripples down here in the corner. Where is it? Down in there. That was a big fish. Verse 27. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like whitewashed tombs, which indeed appear beautiful and outwardly, but inside are full of dead men's bones and all uncleanliness. Jesus describing the Pharisees. Don't be a Pharisee. Don't be so caught up in the word that you forget the meaning. Even so, you also outwardly appear righteous to men, but inside you are full of hypocrisy and lawlessness. I'm going to read one more and then we're going to move on. This is a Pharisee. This is who Paul was, or Saul was. This is the life that he led. And he was killing Jews because of this life. Literally killing Jews. They became Christian Jews, but they were still Jews. He was killing them because they didn't follow the law. This is what Jesus had to say to them. And in 29, the normal woe to you stuff. Because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. We still have monuments of the tombs and the righteous. And say, if we had lived in those days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Claiming, if we'd only been alive back then, we wouldn't have killed the prophets. We would have learned everything and we would have been good people. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Okay, so it goes on to describe more and more stuff of why they're wrong. And then eventually Jesus talks about Jerusalem. This is who Paul was. He grew up doing this. He was born maybe a little bit after Jesus. They're thinking maybe 6 AD. So if Jesus was 30, he'd have been 25, 26. Not an old man. I mean, we read all this stuff that he wrote afterwards. So we assume that he was an old man his entire life. But he wasn't. He was a younger man. So it doesn't matter what your age is. You can be called by God at any age. You can be called late. He had it wrong, but he was zealous for God. He was doing what he thought was right for God. That's why he was singled out. God saw his fervent behavior for God and just told him he was wrong about part of it. The part that you have to do is go out there now and work for me instead of persecuting me. Paul was there and watched the stoning of Stephen, one of the first martyrs of the inner circle. Every one of them, except for John, was martyred. That was their fervent belief and following in Jesus. They all died. John spent a long time in prison. They didn't learn from their Old Testament. They locked Jeremiah up. You can hear the bird squawking. They locked Jeremiah up because he was preaching prophecy to warn them, and they locked him up. Got company coming. I'm going to shut this down for a little bit. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I'm walking right now because the church caretaker brought a couple down here to pick a couple of sites, and I was in one of them. They're going to bring their church group here over the weekend. You know, I've been trying to figure out where we're going to find a church locally, because we're out in the country and there's not a whole lot of options here. Let me walk over here. I can sit down for a little bit. So God has a solution to every problem. If we don't have a church to go to, God will bring it to us. So anyhow, we've been talking about Paul and who he is. Next video, I'm going to cover basically his story. The book of Acts talks about what Paul did, about how he was saved by Jesus, his conversion from Saul to Paul, and why he had a ministry. And Jesus picked the area that he basically grew up in to send him back to reach out to the Gentiles. So it's perfect planning. A zealot for God, misguided, but still, everything he did was for God. God saw that and just turned him around. And he used that same zealous behavior to get the gospel out. If God wants to correct us, you have to be ready to accept that correction. It's simple. God makes it simple for us. We don't have to analyze this stuff and figure it out and get into all the stuff the Pharisees were doing. You don't walk around hitting people over the head with the 50-pound family Bible and threatening them with hell and damnation. If they believe in anything, they're going to believe in God and heaven. You don't have to threaten them. They already have made a choice if they're going to go to hell. They've made the choice to go there. All we have to do is present to them the other side. And if their name's in the book of life, guess what? They're going to accept Christ. We're messengers. We're servants of God. Just do that. All right, we're going to see more about Paul and his 3 missionary journeys. He was a good servant of God, a good epitaph. And the thing is he was looking for the rapture back then. We know from Mark and a couple others that they were in the last days. But what does that mean? That's been 2,000 years ago. But to God, that's 2 days. Keep looking. Keep being a servant to God. Wherever you're at, help to do things. And that will give you your opening to talk about Jesus. All right. Till we meet in the skies, God bless.